So it's a little warm up here today. I'm going to ask you some questions, and feel free to just kind of shout out answers. So let's think about Korean first. In Korea, where do people speak Korean very correctly? Like which city, which province? So, okay. 역시 서울 사람이 그렇게 그런 말 대답을 할 거예요. Right, so you have some opinions about Korean. Where do people speak Korean inside Korea that's very pleasant to listen to or sort of attractive sounding? Like where do you think there's like 어떤 사투리 좋아하세요? 경상도. Okay. So again, people will differ a little bit, but we have some idea, we have some sort of perceptions, values that we associate with different language varieties. All right, so that was first language, right? We're thinking about Korean in Korea. But what about Korean as a second language? How many of you speak Korean as a second language? Even a little bit. 조금이라도. Right. Yeah, I'm holding my hand up too. I speak a little bit. Okay. So, and everybody can respond to these questions. So outside of Korea, from what country, let's say, do people speak Korean very correctly? What do you think? Feel free to call out the answer. Like, can you think of any, I don't know, K-pop idol who are not Korean, but they speak Korean very correctly? Very impressive. Thailand? Yeah, who comes to mind when? Right, good, so Thailand, all right, so there's sort of a positive perception. Oh, people from Thailand who learn Korean end up speaking rather correctly. Any other thoughts? You can have, there's more than one answer to this. Japan, yeah. There are a number of famous K-pop idols, right, from Japan, and they speak Korean very, very well. What about, now let's think a little bit more negatively, okay? Are there any countries or regions where you associate this idea of people who learn Korean as a second language, but you don't like the accent very much? Chinese, okay, so people from Chinese-speaking places, right? Maybe the accent, it's hard to follow for you, or just something about it you don't have as positive perception of maybe as Thailand or Japan, people from those places. All right, so these are opinions, most people have, not everybody thinks the same. It's kind of formed by our experiences, personal experiences, and then sort of larger social experiences, social perceptions. All right, so that's what we're gonna be talking about today. But we're gonna focus on English, right? So how many of you speak English as a first language? Okay, a couple of us. How many of you speak English as a second or additional language? Okay, right, so you spent a lot of time learning English, becoming a speaker of the language, and just like first language English, right, so I'm a first language speaker of American English. I'm not a first language speaker of British English. Some people like British English more than American English. Some people feel the other way around. Some people like Australian English. They just think it kind of sounds cool, maybe cooler than American English. So this is kind of what we're talking about today. As second language speakers of English, you also speak a variety of English, right? Your English is not exactly the same as my American English, okay? And so your variety, might have some identifiable characteristics, and people have feelings about those characteristics. Just like some of you thought that, Korean spoken in Gyeongsangnam-do is, sort of nice sounding, okay? Some people feel like English spoken in the UK is nice sounding. Some people feel like English spoken by people from France is very attractive sounding, okay? So these are some of the kind of perceptions we're gonna talk about here today. All right, and so this study I'm gonna be talking about has been published in Applied Linguistics, and so if you find this whole thing kind of interesting and have a little bit of extra time to read, that's the reference, and there's a link there if you wanna find it. So I'll be giving a summary of this paper, trying to make it pretty accessible. And I'll also, if we have a little time, share with you some cross-generation data not reported in the publication. So the paper actually focuses on the perceptions of Generation Z, right? Are you all Gen Z? Okay, right? So kind of current generation of university students, right? We're following up from a study that was done in 2005 that focused on millennials. So that's me. So we're trying to see, you know, have people's perceptions of different English varieties changed over the years? All right, so a little bit of background to start with. English as a global language, right? So this is a very common occurrence, right? People use English. People from different places in the world use English as a medium of communication. So I'm sure that happens in your class on a daily basis, right? Almost all of you learned English as a second language. Some of you are from Korea, some of you are not, but English is the language you might be using in the classroom or outside of class to communicate with each other. And so it's been estimated that actually the majority of English users around the world are non-native speakers. So I'm the minority, actually, when it comes to English. It's my first language, but I'm not part of the majority group of English speakers. Okay? So that's something sort of interesting about English and motivates us to look at, like, well, what about second language varieties of English? Okay, so kind of moving away from just thinking about native speakers, thinking about what's going on with second language speakers and second language varieties. And so this has gotten a lot of attention in the world of language teaching over the last few years, I guess last couple of decades really. Thinking about how we teach English should also reflect this broader global kind of sociolinguistic reality, right? Modeling everything we teach about English based on me when I'm in the minority. Like, what's the reason for that, right? We can look to a diverse variety of Englishes when it comes to, okay, what grammar should we teach? What sort of pronunciation should we teach in classrooms? But a lot of this research, you know, on global Englishes in terms of awareness or opinions about it has focused on actually L2 users, global English variety users, rather than native speakers. We don't often ask, you know, American English speakers what they think about English spoken in other places. So that has sort of motivated some of what we're doing here today. So looking at biases in second language English, native speaker biases, this is something we've looked at for a long time in the field. One thing we know about English is having an accent, right? It's pretty easy to recognize accents in first or second language, right? When you heard me talking, you probably figured out, like, oh, this guy's from America, maybe Canada, okay? I don't think I sound very British, right? So you probably ruled that out pretty quickly. And this is true for second language speech as well. You know, when somebody speaks to you in English, you can probably figure out, are they a native speaker from the US or UK or not, right? That's something we end up recognizing pretty quickly, whether you're a native or non-native speaker. That said, accent is not all that there is to using English, right? You can speak with an accent, and we all have accents. Some of them are just more or less familiar. You can speak with an accent, even one that's strongly influenced by your first language, and be intelligible. People can understand you, right? So that's what we tend to emphasize in language teaching, right? So we tell people, you know, don't be ashamed of your accent, focus on being intelligible, focus on communicating well, don't worry about your accent so much. But of course there's some stigma associated with accents, okay? Like within the US, there's a huge body of research on dialectology and how people perceive different dialects. So in the US, do you know from which part of the United States is the accent kind of viewed poorly? Any thoughts? Yes, Zhongbong. Right, so the southern US is traditionally where there's been a lot of stigma about how people talk. So think like Texas, Louisiana, Georgia, right? Where people say y'all a lot, okay? That's sort of the stereotype. And the stereotype is they speak slower, the vowels are different. Oil sometimes sounds like all, things like that. So we know that people form judgments about different varieties and different accents. And so thinking about US English in the US and the higher education context sort of motivated our study. Up until COVID-19, that outbreak, we have seen increasing numbers of international students studying in the United States and I think that's kind of recovered. So there are over 1 million international students in the US, mostly people who don't speak English as their first language. So we wanted to kind of contribute to this body of research that has looked at biases related to different language varieties in American universities. There's been a good number of research on this. Native speaking undergraduates in American universities, so people who were like me when I was a college student, sometimes have biases towards second language or non-native English speakers, right? And so we want to investigate that, understand it, and figure out how we can hopefully train people to avoid acting in a biased way. So one of the early studies to look at this issue of, how is non-native speech, how are some of these global English varieties looked at on US college campuses was Lindemann. Stephanie Lindemann published this study in 2005. And what she did is she asked a little over 200 people to just simply rate the English spoken by people from different countries. So what do you think about the English spoken by people from Korea, from Japan, from Saudi Arabia, from New Zealand, right? What do you think about these different English varieties? How correctly do they speak English? How friendly do they sound? And how pleasant is their accent? Okay, those are the questions she asked. And she also asked them to draw on a map. So she gave them a map of the world, no country names, just the borders, and asked them to annotate it, all right? Where do you think people speak correct English? Like circle the areas, right? And so that was her data. And so this was back in 2005. So she probably collected this data while I was still in college. I graduated in 2004. So I'm a millennial, so she was looking at millennials in college. And so what she found, using some sort of fancy statistics, but she sort of found 4 major groups, okay? So the top group there, these were countries that were all rated very high for correctness, pleasantness, and friendliness of English spoken by people from those countries. Take a look at that list. Do you notice anything about those countries? US, Canada, UK, Australia, Ireland, Jamaica? What do all these countries have in common? The main language is English, right? So these are countries traditionally that would be considered native English-speaking countries, where most people grow up speaking English as their first language. Now we look at the other clusters or groups here. The second one is kind of interesting. We have some countries kind of like that, right, where English is the primary language, like New Zealand in there. But then we also see South Africa too. There's a number of people who grew up with English as a first or one of their first 2 languages in South Africa. But we look at the rest of the list and we start to see some non-native English varieties, right? A lot of countries from Europe in this second group. And so these were rated fairly high, but not quite as high as places like the US and the UK. And then as we go down here in the 3rd and 4th groups, these groups were rated a little bit lower, right? And so here's where we really see actually the first countries outside of Europe or parts of Latin America. Okay? So these bottom 2 clusters, these bottom 2 groups, is where we see a lot of countries in Asia and Africa showing up. So there's some kind of clear patterns here. We have sort of our classic native speaker countries at the top, and then Europe kind of gets its own group where they're viewed relatively positively. And then below that, we have countries in other places in the world, right? So this is what my generation as college students kind of thought about different English varieties around the world. And let's talk a little bit too about what she found from the map labeling. So participants, they commented on a number of different things. A lot of times they're sort of grouping countries together, right? So maybe they had a hard time actually differentiating what they thought about Japanese English and Chinese English. They just circled Asia, right? So, and they wrote things about what they thought about Asia. Europe kind of got grouped together, people not differentiating really between Germany and France, just sort of Europe English, okay? But some of the most commonly commented on countries, you put a map in front of people, like which ones do they write something about, which ones do they circle specifically? Australia and Canada, China, France, Germany, India, right? So a range there. These are sort of larger countries, right? And you can see some native-speaking English countries like Australia and Canada, and then several non-native English-speaking countries, right? And there's a whole range of adjectives people use to describe here. Some areas were seen as more correct, right? Like France, Germany, and Italy. So there's this perception that Europeans speak English correctly. This is what millennials thought when they were in college. Other areas were less familiar. People didn't know really what to think about Russian English, okay? So in summary, the participants, the millennial college students in Lindeman's study, they clearly differentiated native and non-native varieties, right? So this is something, we know that being a native speaker is not all there is to using a language, to being a speaker of a language, but among like average people, right? People do recognize it's this sort of psychologically real thing. Oh, that person's a native speaker, that person's not. They can recognize it quickly, and they form various opinions about native and non-native speakers. Within non-native varieties, though, there tend to be more positive perceptions of European, especially Western European varieties of English. Whereas Asian and Latin American countries tended to be more negatively perceived. Some of the most negative perceptions that she found were about Chinese English and Mexican English, okay? That said, Latin American varieties were still a little bit more positively perceived than Asian varieties. And so we've always thought this was an interesting study, my colleague and I, and thought it'd be fun to go back to the same kind of question, the same kind of data, but update it. Look at Gen Z, right? So you all are people who've grown up with a little bit different experiences than what I grew up with. And see, maybe you feel differently about different varieties of English. So we're looking at millennials versus Generation Z. So the millennials were in Lindeman's study, and then our study focuses on Generation Z. Gen Z, at least according to some US research institutions, starts if you were born in 1997 or later. Okay? So I'm guessing that covers most of you. And generations are interesting because, there's some controversy about these generation labels. Like, is Generation Z actually a thing? Like, there's no sort of natural law saying, yes, this is the divide between a generation, okay? That said, it's still sort of useful to look at how different things, different ways of growing up that people of different ages don't experience can shape their perceptions of the world. So thinking a little bit more about generational characteristics, how are Gen Z and millennials similar? And I've noticed actually it's interesting in Korea, a lot of times you see it sort of put together like MG shide, right? Like kind of somewhat younger people. I like it if you say I'm younger still, okay? I like the idea that millennials are still kind of young. So we do have some similarities, right? So at least in the United States, millennials and Generation Z are a little bit more ethnically and racially diverse than previous generations. Though Generation Z is even more diverse. We tend to view this diversity as a good thing in the United States among our generations. And we share a lot of similar views on key political and social issues. So somewhat more progressive in general, view things like climate change as important, feel like we should recognize and try to solve issues related to racial unfairness, racial biases. And we're kind of more open to intergroup relationships and things like that. Some differences though in the US is Generation Z has an even higher proportion of Hispanic Americans. So people who come from a Spanish language culture background, whether it's from Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, right? That's kind of how we define Hispanic in the United States. So in theory, this is sort of interesting because this means there are more people who are speakers of Spanish as a first or second language in Gen Z in America. We also see that Gen Z, a lot of them go into college, right? I think this is probably true of Gen Z here as well. I think something like 60 to 70% of Koreans in Gen Z are getting university degrees, so that's a very high proportion. Gen Z seems to be getting a little bit better when it comes to the economy. When I graduated, there was a global recession. I hope there's not a global recession when you all graduate. So that sort of shapes our experiences. In the United States, Gen Z is also more likely to be, less likely to be immigrants, but more likely to have a parent who is an immigrant, right? So again, more people who might be growing up with another language in the house alongside of English. And this is a really interesting one I want to talk about. There's been this popular idea called digital natives, right? So people who grew up with technology. When did you all get your first smartphone? How old were you? 12? 14? 10? Can anybody go lower? 9 years old, okay. So I got my first like super old style, like Nokia, like rectangle shaped phone. The only game it had was Snake, 9 buttons that you physically push, right? I got that when I was like 16. So I didn't have a smartphone until I was in my 20s, okay? So this is different, right? With a smartphone and with other sorts of technology, you have access to media, connections with people from all around the world, right? You're watching YouTube and TikTok and not, you know, if you're watching stuff in English, not everybody you watch is going to be an American or a British person. You might be watching content in English from somebody in Italy, for all I know, okay, or Argentina, right? So you watch interviews after the soccer games and, you know, Messi's being interviewed in English, right? So you're getting exposed to different, potentially more varieties of English than maybe my generation was, okay? So there are also historical circumstances. One thing that Lindemann talked about in her paper in the US context, my generation in around 2004, you know, this was not long after the 9/11 terror attacks, and then subsequently the United States started a war in Iraq, right? So this led to a lot of tension and a lot of negative stereotypes about people from the Middle East, right? And so she thought that was something that really shaped how people viewed English spoken by people from the Middle East, right? So kind of current events. Also at the time, and this continues to be an issue in the United States, there's a lot of tension about immigration from Mexico, okay? So these kind of socio-political events can shape how people feel about languages too. Currently, you know, what's going on in the world today? Well, the US finds itself sort of, let's say, at different opinions about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. So maybe not so positively viewing the Russian government right now. Kind of competition with China, okay, so, economic competition. And so these are some things that might be influencing Americans who are in Gen Z today. All right, so briefly, you know, variety, we're talking here about varieties as just any sort of recognizable variety. We're also going to appeal to some terms that have been introduced in the scholarship on world Englishes. The sort of native speaker countries that we recognized earlier, those are often called inner circle countries, right? So these are countries people often think of when talking about where do people speak English as a first language. Then there's also a distinction between outer and expanding circle countries. So in outer circle countries, these are where English has usually some official status as a language, and it's often spoken as a second language. So some really good examples of outer circle countries, just to keep in mind, would be like India, where English is an official language, Singapore, where English is an official language. It's not necessarily everybody's home language, right? They might speak Malay or Mandarin at home, but English is something that is used in schools. And even South Africa kind of falls in this outer circle. And expanding is where we often think of English as a foreign language, right? So you might learn it in school, but it's not very widely used in day-to-day life. Okay? So Korea would be a country that falls into this expanding circle. Yes, people here study English a lot. You use it sometimes inside of Korea, but primarily you're using other languages in your daily life. All right. I'm just going to move on a little bit here. So language varieties. So bring us to the current study. Let's talk about what we actually did here a few years ago. So again, we wanted to follow up on Lindemann's study, kind of do many of the same things, but ask Americans, your same generation, your same rough age, what they thought about different English varieties around the world. So we recruited kind of two waves. We recruited people primarily in California and Hawaii. So I happened to be working at a university in California when we started this study, and then we continued it after I moved to Hawaii. And so we ended up with 216 participants, most of them from California. It's a bigger state. Kind of skewing female, more females than males. And then our kind of racial ethnic breakdown is as you can see here. This is a little more larger proportion of white students than we see in the entire generation, but it sort of reflects the population. We have a good representation of actually Asian American students, just because California and Hawaii have lots of Asian Americans, and also we see a good representation of Hispanic Americans too. All right, and so most of these people in our study were monolingual English speakers. They kind of felt like, well, English is the only language I know. But a good number of them talk about, yes, English is their primary language, but they also use other languages. Might be a heritage language or something they learned in school and actually use it. Same with bilingual, multilingual. Right, and so you can see the age here. So this is all just falling into Generation Z. Right, and so we did get some data from other people. If I have a little time, I can show you what that is all about, but we're going to focus on Gen Z first. So we gave them a survey where the first thing they did is they clicked on maps. So we didn't give them a paper map and ask them to draw on it. We gave them a map on a screen and asked them to click on areas where they thought English was, let's say, correct or pleasant, things like that. Then we also gave them the same survey that Lindemann used. So what do you think about English spoken by people from this country? And then we added a new component because we wanted to see if what people believe about a variety actually impacted how they judged a speaker, right? So we let them listen to a speaker, a recording of somebody from one of these countries, and then we asked them to judge how correct was their English, how pleasant did their English sound, did they sound friendly, and we didn't tell them what country the speaker was from. So that's sort of the new thing we added. All right, so now we're going to look at some results from the study. So first, the country ratings. So the same thing that Lindemann did. And so we're going to start with the countries that were rated as highly familiar. And the dark blue bars are Lindemann's results. And the light blue bars are our results, Generation Z. So in a lot of cases, the feelings were pretty similar about how familiar these different varieties of English were. Notably in our sample, Australia and Ireland seemed to be slightly more familiar, and then countries like Jamaica and China were less familiar to our participants. Correctness is what you see here. So again, broadly, these are pretty similar, although you might notice that past the US and Canada and UK, the light blue bars go a little bit higher, right? So that means Generation Z is evaluating English spoken by people from these countries a little bit more positively, right? Which is a nice thing to see. And then this one is pleasantness, where again, we see a lot of similarities, and in a couple of cases, the Generation Z bar is noticeably higher, so slightly more positive perceptions of pleasantness. And these countries I'm highlighting here, these are just the most familiar countries to participants. We actually had a longer list of countries, which we'll get into that in just a moment. And then here's friendliness. And so again, the pattern here is pretty similar overall, but slightly higher ratings for a lot of countries from Generation Z. So now we're going to get into some of the results that deal with the whole list of countries, right? And so these are the results, again, that I just showed you a few slides ago from Lindemann, right? In these 4 kind of groups, the highest, most positively perceived, down to the lowest or less positively received. All right, so we were able to do kind of the same thing and look at 4 groups, but the countries changed a little bit in some of these groups. So our top group, now we have New Zealand joining that top group. So I think people are maybe a little bit more aware of New Zealand. It's a very small country, right? But Gen Z seems to know a little bit more about it. And then we can see the other groups as well. The countries whose names are in bold moved up. The countries with their names in italics moved down. So what's sort of happening here across the board is we are seeing more upward movement. So Generation Z is tending to evaluate English spoken by people from Vietnam, Taiwan, Bosnia, South Korea more positively than my generation did when we were in college. Okay? So to us, this is sort of a good thing, right? So native speakers of English or people who live in the United States who interact with international students on campus fairly regularly are developing more positive perceptions of the English they speak. And in particular, we notice a lot of upward movement for Asian countries. There were a couple of downward movements. Jamaica fell out of that first group, and then a couple of, Latin American and one African country fell down from the 3rd to the 4th group. But overall, the pattern is pretty clear. The attitudes are improving, is what it looks like. All right, so we asked people about their attitudes, what their perceptions are kind of abstractly. When you think of speakers of English from South Korea or Italy, what do you think about correctness, pleasantness? Now we're going to see what they actually did when we asked them to listen to a speaker from several different countries. So we had them listen to 6 different speakers, just talking about like their favorite restaurant. Okay? And you can see the speakers here. So we had English, so Canadian English, Japanese English, Arabic, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Spanish English. And we asked them a few things. We asked them, can you guess which country they're from? Okay. So a lot of people got it right for the Canadian speaker. He had some vowels that were very Canadian. So instead of saying house, house. Can you hear that difference? About. Okay, so kind of gave it away. People were aware of that. They had a really hard time guessing where the other speakers were from. We didn't show them a picture. There was no video. It's just listening, right? So our listeners could probably figure out, okay, who's a native speaker, who's non-native. But when they hear non-native speech, they don't necessarily do a really great job of identifying where they're from. Like for the speaker from Saudi Arabia, and we accepted any kind of Middle Eastern country as a correct answer, only 1% of people got that right. A lot of people guessed Spain or Mexico or something for this particular speaker. It was interesting. But what we can see here is that, yes, the Canadian English speaker, after people listen to him talk, was rated very positively, okay? Kind of unsurprisingly, so this aligns with the country ratings. For the other speakers, the Saudi speaker was rated as being relatively more correct in their spoken English, but otherwise it's fairly similar. The Vietnamese speaker too, a little bit lower than the rest, but mostly in the 6 to 7 range on a 9-point scale. And then when we look at kind of the less linguistic aspects, the less linguistic perceptions, right? Things like friendliness, pleasantness, kind of just, about personality and attitude. All really similar for our non-native speakers. So this is on average. So again, we can see, yes, there's a recognition, some sort of higher perceptions for native speaker, but the non-native speakers are fairly similar. Let's compare that with the country ratings. So what we can see on these graphs, I'll start over here with correctness. So there's a bunch of little dots on the graph. On the x-axis here, this is when we ask people just to rate the country, right? English spoken by people from this country, how correct do you believe it is? That's on this axis. And then the y-axis is for when they actually listen to a speaker from that country, what did they rate the person as? So, for example, if we say, what do you think about the English spoken by people from Japan? They say, oh, it's kind of correct, I give it a 5. When they listen to a Japanese person speak English, maybe they said, oh, yeah, this is mostly correct, kind of correct, I'll give it a 5. That's what the points are. Okay. So what's interesting here is that at lower country ratings, right, where people have this sort of general opinion that, oh yeah, people from Japan's English is, not very correct, there wasn't a strong relationship with how they judged the speaker. Okay. These lines here are kind of flat. But people who had more positive perceptions of the English spoken by people from a particular country, they tended to rate speakers from that country more positively. So this is interesting. People who develop positive perceptions of different English varieties actually apply those positive perceptions when they are listening to actual people speaking English. Okay? So this was kind of nice to see. And the same kind of pattern there is for pleasantness and friendliness. All right, so now I'm going to move on to the results from the map task. And this is where we have, we asked people to click on the map in response to a few different prompts. So the first prompt was, which parts of the world do you associate, or which parts of the world are English-speaking regions? Okay. Where do people speak English? And then the next prompt was, which parts of the world speak English well? After that, in which parts of the world do people speak broken English? So broken English, it's this kind of very not nice way to say that somebody's English is inaccurate or not very clear. And then we asked, where do people speak pleasant English and where do they speak unpleasant English? And so now we get to look at some maps. So we're moving away from numbers and let's see where people clicked. So for English-speaking regions, again, we asked people just click on the map where people speak English. The hotspots of activity are pretty clearly in sort of our inner circle or native speaker countries, right? US, Canada, UK, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and kind of nice to see India, right? Where there are some first language speakers of English and English is a national language in the country. But again, pretty well conforming to the idea of like a native speaker, right? Where do people speak English well? Kind of the same map. I can kind of toggle back and forth. You'll notice that South Africa and India don't attract as many clicks anymore, right? So even within potentially native-speaking English countries, there's kind of a bias towards UK and North American Englishes. Australian English and New Zealand English are still viewed fairly positively. All right, broken English. This one was a little painful to look at, like the whole world. Unfortunately, I'll point out that there were actually some people clicking parts of the United States and Canada, but that was sort of a minority opinion among our participants. You'll notice a really big hotspot here in Mexico, right? So Mexico is the United States neighbor. We have a lot of immigration from Mexico, a lot of Spanish speakers in the US, a lot of people of Mexican heritage. So this was sort of personally kind of sad to see. We also see hotspots in South America, in Europe. So there weren't too many cliques in the UK. It was all sort of continental Europe. And then the biggest difference, we have a big hotspot kind of covering most of Asia. Most of those cliques were in China, but you can also see a concentration of cliques, for example, in Japan as well. Right, so this is something where people seem, American undergraduates seem to believe that many places in the world don't speak English very well. The next map here is about pleasant accents. Okay, so where do US undergraduates feel like people speak English with a pleasant accent? Kind of the US, but actually they like UK accents more. Benedict Cumberbatch, Sherlock Holmes, James Bond, like that kind of stuff is attractive. You'll notice that there's even some cliques on mainland Europe as well. So we see France and Italy and Spain kind of attracting some cliques too. There's also pretty good affinity for Australian and New Zealand English, almost as strong as the United States. So people are sort of recognizing that these are the areas where people speak English pleasantly. On the downside, almost no cliques through this whole part of the world, okay? So not very positive perceptions in terms of pleasantness when we look at the map data here for areas outside of native speaker countries and Europe, right? And so here's the flip side of that. Here's unpleasant accent. So it looks very much like the broken English one, but this is even a warmer color here, right? You see more cliques mostly in China, a good number in India as well. Curiously, there's also some in the United States. So one thing we noticed about Gen Z compared to the millennials, they're a little bit more critical of their own country when it comes to language and stuff. This showed up pretty consistently across all the different data sources we looked at. They weren't negative overall, but they were just less positive than millennials were. All right, so to kind of put these results together, summarize things for us. So Generation Z undergraduates generally provided higher evaluations and slightly more positive perceptions than millennials. So this is good if you believe that we shouldn't be overly judgmental of people who have different accents, who are learning second languages. This is a good thing. And as I just mentioned, the ratings for inner circle countries like US and Canadian English were just slightly lower. So we're sort of kind of coming down from that sort of pedestal, thinking like, oh, native varieties are perfect, right? There's a little criticism there. That said, most of the rankings are pretty similar. One of the big changes was Jamaica that you might have noticed. So that was one that was in the top group for the millennials, and it moved down to the second group for Generation Z. We think this probably has something to do with where the data were collected. So Jamaica is not really on the radar of people in California and Hawaii, but it is not so far from the American Gulf Coast. And in fact, in Georgia, where most of Lindemann's data was collected, there are lots of Jamaican immigrants and Jamaican Americans. So this kind of suggests that maybe some sort of, community experiences, like what languages, what varieties are part of your daily life, also impact how you view those language varieties. So again, the positive trends, like why is Gen Z more positive about Englishes around the world? It's hard to say. We would need to do some more research to confirm, but our thoughts are that, there are increasingly people who use English in movies, sports, music and stuff. They aren't native speakers of English, but they're very popular. And you all are exposed to people like this all the time, okay? Through your smartphones, through the internet, right? So you're growing up with a different set of experiences. I think K-pop's a really, really great example of this, right? So when you think about, how do K-pop fans outside of Korea consume content? A lot of it's in English, right? And so idols get interviewed in English. A lot of songs now are in English, by Korean groups. So this is where we're seeing a lot of activity these days English being an international language of music, movies, and so on. The negative trends, though, I mean, we still sort of see some negative associations with this group of students, particularly related to China, Russia, and Mexico, okay? As I mentioned earlier, there are some continuing kind of tensions politically between the United States and these countries, and so that could have something to do with how people feel about how people speak languages in those countries or from those countries. So this is something, that could be at play as well. And then I mentioned too, although we kind of focused on generational differences, some of the differences, could honestly be as much geographic or demographic as they are generational. So our sample was different in a number of ways from the original study. Again, we collected data in California and Hawaii, where English itself is different, right? The West Coast and Hawaiian English accents are different than Southern English. And we also had a slightly different racial and ethnic makeup of our participants. We had more Asian Americans in our group than Lindemann did, presumably. And so I think if we have time, I can get into a little bit of those results. Just keep an eye on the clock here, yeah. So one thing we noticed is that our Hawaii-based participants had more favorable ratings for Japanese English than California participants. We also noticed that when they were clicking on the maps, they associated the Philippines more positively, like where people speak English, where they speak it well, compared to participants in California, right? And so if you don't know much about Hawaii, I'll tell you a little bit, I'll spoil it. So in Hawaii, the two largest ethnic groups are Japanese Americans and Filipino Americans, okay? So this might explain why, because a lot of our participants from Hawaii might have been Japanese Americans or Filipino Americans. Their aunts, their uncles, their parents, their grandparents might be second language speakers of Japanese English or Filipino English. Okay? So that's kind of a working theory we have here. I'll sort of kind of go over this. So going forward, it'd be very fun to see kind of larger scale research in this line. I don't know if I'll be the one to do it, but maybe in another 15 years, we'll redo the study and see if things change. Do we know what we're calling the next generation yet? Are they alpha? It's alpha, yeah. So maybe one of you, go get your PhD and then you can do the research on Gen Alpha perceptions of English around the world. And just sort of thinking bigger picture, so like, why do we care about this? What does it all mean? Well, all right, so this positive kind of growth that we're seeing for Gen Z is good, but there's probably more that could be done, certainly in American universities, to teach native English speakers to be better listeners, right? To be sort of more sympathetic, kinder listeners, to develop those positive perceptions of English spoken in different parts of the world. Because as we saw in our data, when you have those more positive perceptions, you actually, when you listen to somebody, you view them more positively, right? And that's only going to be better for creating more meaningful relationships and working together collaboratively. So we view that as an important thing that could be done in American universities to improve kind of student experiences. And so we hope to see, maybe Generation Alpha, maybe we'll see continued growth and more good stuff. So that's the main results. Let me see here. Do we have a little more time? Okay, so I just want to show a little bit of the differences between some different generations. So this is just looking at our California data. We actually ended up with people in the sample who were from some of the older generations. So not just Gen Z, but also Millennials. Generation X is what we call the ones before Millennials, and then Baby Boomers. That's before Generation X. And so here, some of the differences are pretty stark. Like for correctness, Gen Z is just pulling ahead of all of these other generations. So maybe there's something bigger happening here, right? Gen Z is sort of really breaking off from previous. So you'll notice that Millennials, Generation X, and baby boomers tended to be pretty similar about these countries, but Gen Z is pulling ahead. Here we have it for pleasantness. Okay, so some of the older generations are fairly positive as well. But again, mostly Gen Z seems to be pulling ahead. What's interesting here too is we looked at the correlations with the speaker ratings, and it seemed like the older generations, the relationship between how they viewed the country and how they judged a speaker was stronger. So they were a little more influenced by their overall attitudes or biases when listening to an actual speaker. All right, so I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. If they have positive biases, it's a good thing, but if they have negative biases, it means they're more harsh when they listen to somebody who speaks a different type of English. And there's more of this. The maps were kind of fun to look at too when we look at different generations. So where do people associate English speakers? So it was the older generation, the baby boomers is what they call them in the United States. They actually clicked on India kind of more frequently, relatively speaking, than other groups. They might have just been more aware of India. They grew up after, right after World War II. India kind of gained its independence, became a major kind of international player. And so they just might be generally more aware of that. But overall, we see kind of similar things, this sort of native speaker country bias across all the generations. For speaking English well, there's a lot of similarities, honestly, across these generations. And then broken English here. The baby boomers, nobody's really clicking in the United States. I think that's sort of similar across the board. And so you see that in a lot of cases, these maps look fairly similar across generations. I think we just see more clicking from people in the more recent generations. So maybe they have a broader set of opinions. And then pleasant accents. So this is what it looks like here. Trying to remember what are some of the salient differences here. Again, it's really similar. North America and especially Europe is popular across generations. And then unpleasantness. So there are some minor differences we're seeing. Generation X we're seeing a little bit more critical of like Northeastern English, but this is really small data, it's hard to say much. For Hawaii though, one thing I do want to highlight here at the end to kind of show you a little bit about where some of our kind of Hawaii specific demographics, we actually see the Philippines light up a little bit, right? As a place where people speak English and also where people speak English well. So this is really different from what we saw in the California data. All right, well, I think I'll go ahead and stop there just to leave a little bit of time for questions. So thanks everybody for listening, and any questions you have, I'd be happy to answer.